Well, I think that's our sign with the recording in progress that we're gonna get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ken Delata, the county conservationist with Oconto County Land and Water Conservation Department. It's been 2 years since this project started on your lake with data collection, and we're ready to talk about it tonight. So, at the first meeting, I showed you on our website where all this data is being housed, that you can go and find it and read it. Well, the county got a new website, so to start off tonight, I'm going to show you quickly our new website and where to find it. So let me see. I just got to share my screen. That's the right one. Okay, can you see the county website screen?
Yep.
Okay, so go up to the top here. Once you get to the county website, you go to the departments, you can click on that. Easiest to scroll down the left side here, find land and water conservation. Click on that. The very top one, you can go read all this other fun stuff if you want. One interested you on the lake is the county waterways and aquatic invasive species. And then on this page here is where you'll find most of your stuff, and I'll just go through them quick. We got some information on aquatic invasive species, the first one. Second one's the countywide lake study. That's where you'll go for most of your stuff with the plans. This third one is for shoreline restoration. If you have an interest in finding out about shoreline restoration, you can call us and we come out, or you can go on here and do a little research yourself. The next one is funding sources. We've got different ways that we can help fund projects on restoration and erosion. So Oconto County Lakes and Waterway Organizations, that's all the organizations and clubs and stuff in the county that we have information for. And then topographic lake maps, that's the new maps that are being done with this lake study. So you can go in there and the new maps you can look at. So I'll go into the countywide lake study. And here you can see the first one is the operational strategy and plan. That's the kind of more of the county plan, but you're welcome to read it. The next one is the all lake summary, where all the lakes, once they're completed, gets put in here to compare to each other. Third one's the project update that you could have been looking at all along, that we tried keeping all the lakes up to date on what's happening. Then the bottom one is the individual lake summary, reports, surveys, plans, and virtual meetings. So if you go into there, you can see the whole list. This is all the ones we're working on in the county. As you can go down to Surprise Lake, and there should be, here's your lake summary report. After tonight, in a few weeks, the draft plan will be on there once we get stuff put together to start with. Then you'll be able to go read that draft on there. And by all means, tell your neighbors that couldn't make it, whatever, to go on here and look at what they'd like. If you go back to the top here on the left, it's the lake surveys. And then the one below is the lake study virtual meeting recordings. Now, again, if neighbors couldn't make it and want to see what this meeting was about, in about a week or so, it'll be posted on there that they'll be able to go on and rewatch the meeting, basically. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I guess the only other thing I'd like to point out on the Zoom program, on the bottom center of your screen, it says chat at any time. If you have a question and don't want to interrupt, mostly Ryan doing the speaking tonight, or Chip's here. Feel free to type a question in there, and we'll be watching that as we go, and we'll make sure they get answered. Or if it's an appropriate time, just interrupt us and feel free to ask a question. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Dale Moore from UW Extension just to talk for a few minutes before we get started.
Good to see everybody tonight. Working on Surprise Lake was one of them that I was able to get out on myself with the Brenda Nordine, who's not going to be here tonight. She didn't trust me enough to run the motor. I got a full disclosure on that, but she did have me use the metal pole, checking the aquatic vegetation on the bottom of the lake. So I was able to do that a number of times. So anyway, I have a sort of an intimate knowledge of your lake. It's a beautiful water body. And really what I want to say is that when we have our specialists here, we have Ryan and others that will introduce themselves, is that when they're off working on another lake down the road, once this plan is initiated or finalized in most people's minds, is that it's a document and it can't be changed. Ryan's going to mention that it is a living document. And with that comes the staff at Oconto County here. You've got Ken in the office, Steve with Ocala, and myself with UW Extension that understand the value of the water body, will help you champion changes that you would like to see, as well as make you aware of any grants that might be out there. One of the things is when you do get your draft of the lake management plan, the last chapter talks about organizing and communication. And it gives you a little bit of ideas and techniques on how you might be able to go and talk to your neighbors, maybe start to organize in an unofficial way or an official way to become one voice for your lake. So if you're sort of stumped on ideas on how to take this plan to the next step, just be advised that I will try to reach out every spring to each of the lakes that have an adopted plan to see where you are at, what we can do to help you, and if there's any projects that you might need assistance with grant writing, that sort of thing. So we're not going to forget about you, and we don't want you to forget about the plan. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan, but I just want to say you're in good hands going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. All right. Thanks, everyone, for attending. My name is Ryan Haney. I work at UW-Stevens Point in the Center for Watershed Science and Education. And we've collaborated essentially here with Ken and Dale at Oconto County, the DNR, and Oclawa. A few groups have come together to put on this Oconto County Lakes project. And so essentially the county is trying to identify the status of their lakes, issues on their lakes, having recognized that these lakes are a major driver of the economics in Oconto County and recognizing their importance. And so back in 2016, this project started. You guys are just now coming into the fold here. The end goal is to do a lake study and create a lake management plan for 60+ lakes in the county that have public access. There's about 300+ lakes in the county overall, a little over 60 with public access, which is what has made them available for these public dollars. So we're going in and doing a baseline study in all these lakes, and then following up with citizens in the area to develop a lake management plan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we have learned about Surprise Lake, what's going on in Surprise Lake, and why we want to create a lake management plan. Again, the lake management plan is designed to just kind of be a one central document that houses everything we know about the lake. So there's a lot of various entities, whether it be the DNR, sportsmen's clubs. Of course, you've got the lake owners themselves, property owners themselves. Sometimes you might have the university coming in to do a study. There's a lot of different things going on. You've got the town and the highway departments, managing drainages and culverts and things like that. And so the lake management plan is designed to be a clearinghouse document of everything we know about the lake, and coupled together with the goals and visions for that lake, for the management of that lake. And that's where you guys come in. So we've collected some information, and we're here to kind of garner your knowledge and your input on what will go into this management plan. So the idea is to address any issues that may exist on the lake, and then reduce conflicts or issues in the future. Let's see here. So just again, we're in the planning process now. The format has been a 2-year lake study. So we've been doing various surveys on Surprise Lake, taking water samples, doing that for the past 2 years. We had a kickoff meeting a couple of years ago, which some of you may have been at, some of you may have not, to kind of introduce this project. So now we've got our 2-year study done, really just kind of a snapshot in time, but we've got some good baseline data for Surprise Lake, and we're into the management plan development stage. So this is where we share what information we have with you guys, share our recommendations, get any input you may have, and then we'll draft a management plan for Surprise Lake. As Dale mentioned, that's designed to be an evolving document. So it houses what we know now and where we're going. And then as we learn new things or develop new strategies, that just gets updated in the plan. once we have a plan finalized, and I'll talk about how we're going to go about that at the end here, that plan goes on file with the DNR, goes on file with your local municipality, with the highway department, all these various entities that will be aware of it, and so and be able to use that as a reference. Lake management plans are governed under NR 193. So there's a variety of components to the lake management plan, things that have to be assessed, things that have to be evaluated. Basically, what this goes back to is that, you know, with issues on the lakes, whether they be invasive species or developing landings or things like that, there's a lot of demands on funds for lakes. And so what's been created is a structure to develop a holistic understanding of your lake. And so that a lot of lakes have gotten issues with, say, milfoil, and they just develop tunnel vision and go down this highway without really recognizing how their lake works and without having appropriate expectations for their lake. And so the comprehensive lake management plan is really designed to be that resource for you as homeowners and for us as resource managers. Now that said, that the process it can be complex, but part of the service here is that we will begin drafting this lake management plan for your lake. It's organized into a series of chapters, essentially. So we have a chapter on aquatic plants, we have a chapter on water quality, chapter on recreation, chapter on habitat, things like that, the watershed. And so each one of these chapters will end with a goal for that category, followed by objectives and action items that can be implemented. And some of these items are for you as individual homeowners to implement, so you choose. Some of them are items for your town to implement or your agency. So not having, I don't believe you guys have an official organization for Surprise Lake. So not having that, you know, the initiative really relies on various individual people, but we'll talk about that more as we go here. So I'll talk about how we're going to finalize the plan, but just to kind of orient you on what the plan looks like and what it's supposed to do. So with that, our first chapter is fisheries, and we have Chip Long here with the DNR, who's your fisheries biologist for the area, to talk about what he knows about Surprise Lake.
Well, thank you, Ryan, and I'll just ask if you can hear me okay.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, let me get set. And I assume you can see my screen as well.
Yes.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Chip. I'm a fish biologist, and my office is out of Peshtigo. And I always start with a slide to kind of show the distribution of staff across the state, because I like to put your individual lake, Surprise Lake, in the context of the department and fish management and really what I do. So on the left here, we have, this is a statewide map with all the biologists. So you can see I'm over here in the Northeast, but every one of these white boxes is a fish biologist. There's probably about 40 of us statewide. We have staff that work on Lake Superior. This shaded area, which Surprise Lake is in the ceded territory. So we have 2 biologists and 2 supervisors that deal with all those specific management issues. We've got a north and south unit over here on Lake Michigan, and we also have a Mississippi River team with biologists up and down that. So probably 45 or 50 biologists statewide, and you can see it zoomed in a little bit. I work Marinette County and then the northern portion of O'Connell County, or north of Highway 6432, that portion of the county. So for example, I wouldn't manage Anderson Lake or Shoe Pond. Those would fall on my counterpart Tammy Paoli's plate, but I would do everything north. So just gives you a good idea how we're structured as a team. But also within Marinette and O'Connell County combined, there's, about 820 lakes or 25,000 acres of surface water in the form of lakes that we manage. And my lakes are stratified based on size. So my largest lakes lakes that are over 1,000 acres are high profile lakes, or lakes that we would do more work on because obviously they get more use and we've just got more invested in them. When I first started about 13 years ago, these lakes were on a 4-year rotation, which meant I was on one of those 4 lakes, High Falls, Cauldron Falls, Lake Knockbee, or White Potato every year. And that just seemed a little excessive. We were able to move those to a 6-year rotation, and a couple of those were actually going to move to 8. Lakes between 100 and 1,000 acres, we define as public access fisheries. They're on an 8-year rotation. And then anything less than 100 acres is as time permits or as necessary if we have some management issue we want to address. But in addition to just lake fisheries, we also manage trout streams, which between the 2 counties, there's a little over 1,000 miles of classified trout stream. So between the regular fish population surveys, we also do habitat work. We work on road stream crossings, beaver management, habitat management. So quite a bit going on our trout stream resources as well. And this is a table that I like to just show, and I don't expect you to read it. It's just more of a visual tool. Depending on the type of survey or the species of fish we want to sample, we have a recipe or a cookbook. This is our fisheries handbook that kind of outlines the type of sampling we would do, when we would do it, what metrics or data we want to collect to evaluate that population. So it's not just me flying off the cuff, trying to make those decisions. This is all outlined. It took several decades to come up with these prescriptions to provide good data. And what it does do too is it provides that consistency over time, and it makes your data more comparable, not only within a lake, but across a larger geographic area. So it's a very, very useful tool, especially for newer staff that maybe aren't as experienced with particular resources. But this is kind of how we're structured and what we do. So, depending on the type of species we want to collect will depend on the type of gear that we use. And one of the things that we do quite often is we play with electricity and water, which goes against everything you've ever known, but we can do it in a safe way. So this is an electrofishing boat from a driver's perspective. 2 people on the front of the boat, net and fish. We have a generator, which would be in the back of the boat, transmits electricity down these booms to these rings and down into the water. That'd be your positive, and the boat's the negative, and that's how the electricity flows, creates a relatively large field, 15 to 20 feet in front of the boat and around the boat, probably 5 to 6 feet deep. You can be effective. And these mats that the netters are standing on act as a safety switch. Now, I'm a little bit short, so sometimes when I lean over these railings, my feet do come off the deck sometimes if I'm really stretched out, and that disconnects the current. Because if you did fall off this boat, and for those of you that do know a little bit more about electricity, we can be running sometimes between 250 volts, which, depending on water conductivity, could equate to anywhere between 50 and 20 amps. And that's a lot of power. So if you did fall in the water and the current was on, the results wouldn't be good. Let me just put it that way. So we do have to do this safely. And the way I do describe it is we're like a bird on a wire. We're on the same potential. Everything in this boat is grounded to the hull. Number 1 rule of thumb is you just don't touch or grab anything outside the boat. And we can do that safely and effectively. This is a Fike net, if you were to see one in the water. This is more of a passive gear. We set the nets and we leave and we come back the following day. So this is connected to these frames out here. There's a net. You have these floats on there, and then on the bottom is a lead line. So it goes all the way to the bottom. So fish, as they're traveling the shoreline, they can't go around it this way. As they try and swim around that net, they get caught in a series of traps and baffles down here. And at the following day, we can pull this end up, untie it, and take the fish out. So one of the gears we use. This is what it might look like if it was underwater. We would like to keep this lead down, but once the fish go in, they can't find their way back out. So pretty useful piece of sampling equipment for us to assess fish populations. One of the other big pieces of data that we collect is the age of fish, and we do that by collecting scales, or we might use spines, and they also have bones in their head, which are called otoliths. Obviously, they're protected, so they generally show the true age of the fish. The downside is you have to sacrifice the fish to remove those, so a lot of times we don't use those. Scales are pretty reliable, especially on younger fish, but if they were to lose a scale, which they do for various reasons, some fish lose scales. It's a defense mechanism. If a fish were to grab them, they shed their scales real easy. They do regrow scales, and scales will be regenerated. And what we do with the scales is we dry them, and then we press them on like a plastic microscope slide in a press like this. And this is exactly what ours looks like. And it creates an image that we enlarge using like a microfiche machine, like you might look at newspapers at the library. It's the same setup. And then we can count these annuli and tell how old the fish is. And we can tell, it's good information because we can tell if growth is fast or slow or average compared to maybe a previous survey on the same body of water, or how growth it compares to other lakes in the area, or again on a larger geographic area. So growth is a big thing that we do too when we assess fish populations. So now I'm going to jump into some Surprise Lake specific fisheries data. Now, we just had a meeting previous to this and I had 2 slides. So I'm glad that I've got some data tonight to share with you on Surprise Lake. Back in 2013, the legislature appropriated between $7 and $8 million to the DNR specifically to raise, stock, and buy large fingerling walleyes to stock across the state. And that was defined as the Wisconsin Walleye Initiative. And Surprise Lake fell into a category of lakes where the state was going to invest. And this wasn't done by me. This was done by our Madison staff. They applied stocking rates, or the number of fish per acre, randomly across the state to lakes. And Surprise Lake was one of those. So that stocking effort started in 2016. We stocked 5 fish an acre in alternate years and have been doing that since 2014. Those fish, it's only 328 fish about per stocking event. And here's the average length. So they're on average 8 inches long. And those are generally stocked depending on the spring. Early spring, the fish are a little bit bigger. In the fall, if it's a late spring, they're a little bit smaller. But on average, and we generally would stock those sometime mid to late September or early October. It just depends on the growing season in a given year. So we did a fish survey on Surprise Lake back in 2016. And again, we did an electrofishing 1-night survey, and we also did 5 days, 4 or 5 days of fyke netting on your lake. And this would have been done in April. And these were our survey results, with bluegill being the most abundant, followed by black crappie, largemouth bass, walleye. We collected 52 walleye, which I'll talk a little bit more about this since our stocking history only goes back to 2014. There was already an existing population there. And then you can see, followed by a couple panfish species, white sucker, a few pike, pumpkin seed, and a couple bullheads. And here's the size range. So bluegill's up to 9.5 inches, black crappie up to 13.6. Some of this is probably ringing a bell for those of you attending tonight that are fishermen or women. Some of these might be surprising and others may not be. So these are just our survey results divided by gear. So this is our electrofishing boat. Now, Surprise Lake was very unique, and it's probably one of the few lakes in my area. It's not the only lake, but it's one of the few lakes in my area where electrofishing just is ineffective. The water is very low in conductivity, which as a result, it just doesn't conduct electricity. And I was struggling to shock fish. As a matter of fact, I burned my unit up that night. We had to stop because we broke down. I was just trying, I had to put so much power in the water to get the fish to react. It was very ineffective. Hence the low numbers of fish we collected. Now, if you look at our fyke net survey below here, you can see we did it from April 12th through April 17th. As soon as the ice went out, we were very effective. We caught, again, that's where we caught all of our walleye, all of our pike, and more bass. Usually we don't catch a lot of bass, and you can see for ineffective as we were electrofishing, we still caught, quite a few fish. But this just is a breakdown. And we did generate a report. And if someone wants a copy of that, please reach out to me via email. And I do have a copy of this management report. A lot of this data came directly from that report. So here's our walleye length frequency. So you have the number of fish over here on the y-axis, and this is the length group that they were in. These 11 and 12-inch fish were from the 2014 stocking, which they were good to see. We know we got good survival. Again, we only stocked 328 fish, and here's 24 of them. And this is just what we collected. So you'd have to assume that there was a lot more out there. And then we did get a couple older fish, which would lead us to believe there must be some reproduction. And again, with no stocking history, when and where did these fish come from? So they obviously persisted. A lot of these fish up in here were between 11 and 15 years old. So, which is pretty typical. Once they reach sexual maturity, which, would be in this 13, 14, 15-inch range, growth really starts to slow down because they put a lot of energy into gamete production, eggs and whatnot. So but yeah, we did have some, again, 4 fish in the 25-inch length group, which was surprising. So a lot of nicer walleye out there. And again, good survival of our stockfish. So I anticipate the next time we do a survey out there, there'll be a lot more fish in these length groups here, just because now we have, well, we're not relying on reproduction. We're going to have consistent recruitment or consistent additions to the population. And that's primarily through stocking. And we'll be able to drill down, if there is natural reproduction, because we know what years we've stocked fish, and we'll be able to age those pretty accurately back, 6, 8 years. Once they get a little older than that, there's just error in assigning ages to fish, and you just can't get away from that. Bluegills, again, very nice, robust bluegill fishery. Again, a lot of 6 inches is what we define as harvestable. So again, you're talking a couple hundred fish in that 6-inch group, and then even at 7 inches, you had 100 between 7 and 7.5, and 60 plus in the 7.5 to 8. And again, obviously a lot fewer fish as they get bigger, and that's not surprising. Those are desirable fish, and they're starting to get old at that age, or at that size. A lot of these fish might be 10 to 12 years old, if not a little bit older. Oh, actually 8 to 9, excuse me. Here's our age and growth for bluegill. And this is average for northern Wisconsin. So you can see well within the standard deviation. So I would call that average growth. Even though you're above the line and below the line here, you're within that one standard deviation. So that's good growth for bluegills here. For largemouth bass, again, fairly decent size structure. I mean, you've got a lot of the fish above 14 inches, the minimum length limit. We didn't really get a good handle on the bass population there, just because we weren't effective with our electrofishing boat, and probably won't be in the future. So we have to make that decision too. Is fyke netting adequate enough to assess the major components or the populations of interest there? So with that, I'm going to kind of just transition over to fish habitat. And, the most sensitive or critical area to fish and really all aquatic organisms is that near shore area, which we define as littoral zone. So it probably won't come as a surprise to you to know that, fish and other aquatic life spend more time along an undeveloped shoreline and a developed shoreline. That's pretty self-explanatory. But again, that's the area of the lake we really is the most sensitive and most critical for aquatic life. And here's a map of Surprise Lake, a depth map. Now, this is a pretty old map, but at least it gives you something to go by. You have these 3 main basins within the lake. Again, it's a seepage lake, so no inlet or outlet. This says 65 acres. I think I've got another book that says 70. So we're pretty close. I assume this map was probably generated in the 1950s. Maybe it was Wisconsin Conservation Department back then. So quite a while ago. But I do like to use this as we start to look at what sort of habitat techniques we may want to implement in a lake like Surprise Lake. One thing that we do a lot of is what we call fish sticks, where we take full-size trees and place them on the ice generally. I'm not a big advocate for cutting trees down along the shoreline unless you've got a problem tree, or maybe it's a tree that's dying or in the process of dying and you want to utilize it for fish habitat, or you're creating a viewing corridor. But a lot of times these trees are brought in from offsite. We generally do them in mid-late February when the ice is the thickest. And we'll place clusters of them. And we work with individual property owners. And if a property owner doesn't want to participate, that's okay. And sometimes we put them on property lines where we don't compromise anybody's use of their shoreline. And we accommodate for swimming areas or docks or whatever your use of your shoreline is for your own leisure. So this is a top-down view here on the left of what that might look like. Several trees, we might cable them together down here towards the trunk, maybe up towards the crown a little bit. And this is a cross-sectional view. What we really want is we'd like a relatively good drop off. Again, it's a tree that's 20 to 30 feet long. We really want this crown and this branching submerged, because that's the valuable part of the tree in terms of habitat and cover. And again, these aren't just good habitat for fish and hiding places. It's a good substrate for aquatic invertebrates and other things that juvenile fish eat. And it's good habitat for maybe a bird to perch or a turtle to sun. So it's not just for fish. It is a good habitat technique. And I think Ryan will get in specifically and how we quantify woody debris in a lake and why these additions or this habitat technique is so beneficial to your overall lake health. But this is a project that we do on a regular basis. I did a couple lakes in northern Marinette County last year where we put about 160 trees out on 2 different lakes at, I think, 20 some locations. Here's an example of a project that on Pia Lake, which isn't too far down the road from you guys. This was back in 2018. I think Ken was involved with this one. I think we put trees at 17 different properties, and this lake's about 135, 140 acres. So it's about twice as big as your lake, but we did this again, do this in mid-late February. But then what we do is we come back and we actually drill through these trees. This is a gas powered drill made by Steel, and it can drill through these frozen trees because we're out there in February. And then what we do is we attach a cable and an anchor, and we just use this crimping tool to crimp these down. And then we come back when the ice goes out, once these have sunk down on the ice, and we drive these down with a steel rod into the ground so they don't drift away and become a navigation or safety hazard or someone else's problems, because we want them to be where we put them. So that's one of the things that how we partner on some of these projects. We also do walleye spawning habitat. Typically these are on the southeast side of our lakes, because your winds are northwest prevailing in the springtime, and the wind and wave action, they broadcast spawn. Walleyes don't make nests. Again, they'll lay their eggs. Their eggs will go down into the gravel, and the wind and wave action is what keeps them aerated. From fertilization until those larvae swim out is only about 10 days. But again, the sun, the moon, and the stars and everything has to go along perfect for those fish to actually survive. So they do work. This is over on Archibald Lake. This was an extension of an existing reef that was done about 10 years prior. I think this was done in about 2017. So this reef from there to the other end, the original one, is about 1,200 feet. Fish do use it. We do see reproduction, not enough to sustain the fishery, but it does augment or supplement the existing habitat. We also do fish cribs. This is over on Wheeler Lake. This group has built fish cribs, I think 7 or 8 out of the last 10 years. I think we've built 80 total. So what they order their logs and they spread them out on the ice for us. And then I bring that same drill over and we drill holes equidistance apart. And then what they do is they construct these cribs, generally in conjunction with a fishing derby or whatnot. And then we actually come back in the spring once the ice goes out. These are all built in about 4 or 5 feet of water. We hook up on each side with our boats and we drag them out into the lake. We'll drop one, we'll throw a buoy on it, we'll get a GPS coordinate, and then we generate a nice map for the file or for whoever calls. We don't post them at the bait shop, but whoever calls, we provide that information for them. But in this particular lake, we put out 80 plus, I think, over in, I think, 4 or 5 different locations over the last decade. So again, not the most ideal habitat technique. And I had to catch myself. These really aren't placed in the littoral zone because by statute, there has to be 5 foot of water over the top of these when we put them out in the lake. Additionally, they can't be on really soft sediment because we don't want them to sink in the mud. And they can't be on a slope of greater than, I think, 4 to 1 because gravity still works underwater. If you put them down and they slide, they're not where we intended them to be. It's more of a quantity versus a quality technique. If you place only a few, you start to get competition and user conflicts. Everybody wants to sit over the fish cribs to fish. And sometimes they will concentrate fish on smaller bodies of water. So you don't necessarily want to concentrate fish. The goal isn't to make them easier to catch. It's to provide some cover and some nursery habitat in areas of the lake where there might not be, aquatic vegetation or other habitat types for fish to utilize. But this is something you can do. They're relatively cheap and inexpensive to build. And just some of the other things that I work on. I mean, all the fish stuff is cool, but there's a lot of administrative behind the scenes things that we work on. So work planning, we do all this work, but we have to plan to do it. And, sometimes we discover new problems and we have to report it. We get money from the federal government based on license sales. So we have to be accountable for what we're doing. I work on things like land acquisitions, just simple easements, boating, fishing access, larger parcels to gain access to rivers and lakes. So I work on that. A lot of permit reviews, anything from high capacity wells, road crossings, if it comes within the right of way of a lake or goes over a trout stream. Property management. I wish I owned, but I manage a couple larger fishery properties in Marinette and primarily Marinette County, several thousand acres. I do a lot of outreach, like things that we're doing tonight. This is an outreach event. I work with a lot of kids groups, go to the county and state fairs, sit on department teams. I sit on the Muskie team, and I've worked on several task groups to deal with different policy issues. Regulation development, we go out and do all that work and we define a problem, between stocking. Regulations is our other big tool in our toolbox to manipulate fish populations. So that's something that we do, and we vet those through the spring hearings, which will be coming up in April. and establish working relationships with lake associations such as your own Sportsman's Club and other groups. And always looking for outside funding. You think we're the Department of Natural Resources, but our pockets aren't bottomless. We still have to, seek funding to do projects. I worked with a municipality over in Marinette County about 3 years ago. They had a $40,000 budget for a road stream crossing, and we were able to turn that into $200,000, get some grants. So they put in a real ecologically friendly road stream crossing. So that was, a project we worked on. And then we have a lot of grants through our department to improve, boating and fishing access. So that, a couple projects we worked on in Oconto County. Maiden Lake is one that just a simple landing dock. I think the Lake Association put up $2,500. It's a town landing. They put up $2,500 or something. And don't quote me on that there. Hey, excuse me. There was can you still hear me? I'm getting a warning that my connection is unstable.
You're better now.
So you can hear me. So yeah. So we do work on a variety of things. So, hey, if there's something that we covered tonight and you know what, you're later on tonight or tomorrow, you think, oh, I wish I'd asked that during the meeting as it relates to fisheries and fisheries management. This is my contact information, phone or email. It doesn't matter. I'll be timely in your response, and I'll be here through the rest of the meeting tonight. So if you've got a question and you wanted to put it in the chat, that's great. I'll do my best to answer. If I don't have an answer tonight, I can get back to you tomorrow. But I can entertain any questions for a few minutes now if anyone has one. Well, with that, I will, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'm going to pass it back off to Ryan.
Thank you, Chip. All right. So yeah, Chip will be around, and again, part of the goal tonight is just to introduce you to some of the folks and resources that you have available to you. So Chip is one of those right down the road. Definitely hit him up for all things fishery. All right, I'm going to go back and start talking about some of the other things we learned on your lake, and I want to back out for just a second. Again, just to kind of understand our lake in a comprehensive way. It's something to know that lakes go through a normal aging process. These lakes were created 10,000 plus years ago, following the last glaciation. So they've been around a while, and we're just now coming around. So our two-year snapshot is, a pretty small fragment of time for how long these lakes been around. But these lakes are low spots on the landscape. So just like the moat you might dig on the beach or something like that, they're going to fill up over time as plants and animals decay, as sediment and things wash into the lake. So that's a pretty much a one-way road for lakes. It's a natural process. Barring any other major geologic events, eventually, Surprise Lake will fill up over time and become a marsh and, a wetland at some point. But the important thing to understand is that, what we do in and around the lake generally has a tendency to accelerate this process. And so that's one of the things we try to mitigate when we're managing a lake is trying to preserve the age of our lake. Kind of like we're all trying to do with ourselves, I guess. And then also understanding that, just a revisit of the water cycle. So where's our water coming from and where's it going? Just water falls from the sky as precipitation, right? And it hits the ground. Some of that water gets a chance to infiltrate into the soil and become groundwater. And groundwater, similar to water on the surface, will generally be moving downhill to its nearest water source. As a seepage lake, Surprise Lake, you get most of your water through that groundwater source. Some of that precipitation becomes runoff and runs across the surface of the landscape to our nearest water body. The problem with that water source is that it has a lot of energy, so it tends to carry a lot of contaminants with it. It tends to erode on its way and carry soil with it, things like that. And so as we've developed the landscape, of course, we have increased that surface runoff component and reduced infiltration. So a general theme of lake management, keeping your lake healthy, is mitigating some of that short circuiting of the water cycle we've done over time. So what shapes a lake's character, right? So why is Surprise Lake different from the pickerel chain across the road there? And these are affected by a variety of things. Like we've talked about our lake type. We're a seepage lake, as opposed to a drainage lake or a reservoir and impoundment like Machicany or something. We're 10,000-year-old natural lake. We're not a man-made lake. We've got our geology and our soil types that are part of this part of the state. We're not going to change that. It is what it is. As Chip was saying, our geology and our soil types have created a soft water in this lake that's actually kind of hard to ends up being hard to do the boom shocking in, and that's a factor of the minerals and some of that stuff that is in that groundwater that's being that primarily feeds the lake. So we've got seasonal environmental changes. Obviously, our lakes freeze over a good part of the year. When you're studying lakes down in Florida, that's not a part of the cycle, but that has a pretty intense effect on our lakes up here. And then, of course, what we're doing on the landscape. So not only right at the shoreline, but in the watershed itself. So these are all big components on what's going to affect our lake. As Ken mentioned at the beginning, here's our new bathymetric map. So this is the new sonar map created for Surprise Lake. This is available on the website. We have 6-acre seepage lake with a max depth of 20 feet. This sonar scan here, I see at least 27 they found in that hole there, that deepest part there on the north end. So, we're in fact a little bit deeper than 20 feet, it looks like. But that may be a factor of the water level as well, which we can talk about. There's a survey online. A lot of you have taken it actually for Surprise Lake. If you haven't, seek that out. I think it's in your meeting invitation, but the survey is a good place to kind of quantify our various perspectives on the lake, as well as there's a lot of open-ended questions for comment and things like that. This is one of the questions from the survey. What do you value most about Surprise Lake? Beautiful place to visit, the lake community, family time, quiet family gatherings. So again, this is kind of the essence of what we're trying to preserve here in our lake management plan. And then if your perspective as a lake user, what are the biggest impacts to Surprise Lake? Shoreline erosion, and then watercraft operations. So whether it be high-speed boats or excessive watercraft, that was kind of the comments I got on terms of the perceived biggest impacts to Surprise Lake. So we'll talk about that too.
Hey, Ryan, real quick,
Yes, sir.
the slide didn't move forward. It's still on the lake aging process. I don't know
Oh,
if
you're
you just
still in
want,
lake aging process?
yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that. Let me see.
I don't know what happened.
You got the water still there now?
There you go.
Yep, where the water's coming from. Yep.
Okay. So there's just a diagram on sorry about that. Looks like I kicked off again. Okay, we back where we were there?
Yep.
we talked about the lake character. Sorry, here's the new bathymetric map I was talking about. If you didn't get to see that before, it's available on the website. And as we discussed, it made, you know, these lakes depths and areas tend to vary over time. So it's officially a 66-acre lake at 20 feet. So our one of our next chapters will be water quality. So we did, you know, a couple of years of sampling on the lake. And one of the first things we do is water clarity. I don't remember if Surprise Lake has a volunteer monitor or not. But if people are interested in continuing some of this monitoring that we did for this project, just to continue that data set, continue that baseline, there are DNR has a program, Citizen Lake Monitoring Network, that will provide you the training and the equipment you need to conduct some of this monitoring. So water clarity is something we measure. This is a Secchi disc. It's a standardized disc that we essentially just lower into the water until it disappears, and we measure what that depth is. In you know, one measure by itself doesn't mean a whole lot, but once you get a good long data set of measurements here, you can start to monitor and detect change at very easily and very cheaply, just by this measurement here. So this measures how far light is penetrating into the water, which is, you know, can be controlled by a number of things. If you've had a busy boating weekend, for example, you know, your water clarity might not be as good after that, or if there's been an algae bloom, versus other times when it's quiet and it can be clear. So again, those depths vary, but over time they can start to you know, you can start to monitor trends or change in a lake. So here's the water clarity measurements that we were able to find for Surprise Lake. So you can see our grouping of measurements there to the right for the past couple of years during the study. And then we did find a handful of measurements from the mid-70s on water clarity for Surprise Lake. So compared to those measurements in the 70s, water clarity is less now than it was then. Keep in mind that's based on just a handful of samples from the 70s, so I wouldn't hang my hat on that per se. Current water clarity ranges from about, you know, 6 to, looks like we got even near, you know, over 15 feet at one point. So those are considered very good to excellent readings in terms of water clarity in general. When we compare those measurements to you know, some of those historic measurements, again, you know, they're lower, but it's still in a very good range. Another thing we look at when we go out and sample is we look at temperature. So the temperature of the water can varies with depth typically. At the surface, your water temperatures tend to be similar to what the air temperature is, of course. And then at depth, your temperatures, groundwater coming into the lake is usually between about 45 and 55 degrees, and that's pretty constant year round. So you have this groundwater component input at the bottom of your lake with a very constant temperature. And then of course the temperature near the surface is changing with the seasons. And so what happens is you end up developing what's called a thermocline. So where the more buoyant, warmer water at the surface separates and floats on top of the colder water on below. And then every spring and every fall, as the ambient air temperatures approach that 45 to 55 degree range that your groundwater is, you get what's called an overturn event, where the water in the lake at shallow and at depth is all a similar temperature, and you get a big mixing event. And then it separates again for the winter. And so it's a kind of a neat aspect of your lake. And so each time we go out to the lake, we go to the same spot over the deepest part of the lake. And in addition to take our own water sample, we lower some instruments down and we measure temperature. And so here's a graph of temperature. Each one of these colored lines is a different sampling event. This is a different day we were out there. And we start measuring the temperature near the surface, and we lower it down a few feet and measure it again and lower it down a few feet until we get to the bottom. And so on this graph, the surface of our lake is at the top of the graph. That's 0 depth, going down to about 25 feet. And then we've got our temperatures there. Again, our temperatures near the surface are going to be similar to what the ambient air temperature is. So you can see all our summer readings there, you know, in the 60s and 70s near the surface. And then we go down with depth, and then we get to about a lot of those measurements. Sorry, whomever took those, might have been me. I don't remember the various ones, but they seem to stop at around 10 or 12 feet. But the two longer profiles you can see there, we've got a pretty consistent temperature down to about 10 feet, say. And that's because of wave action, wind, boating, things like that moves it up. Mixes it up, but then you reach about 10 to 15 feet and our temperature drops off and then approaches that closer to 50 degrees, which is our groundwater temperature. And so that depth there between about 10 and 15 degrees is called our thermocline. And that's where we develop that separation between shallow and deeper water. Now, the orange and gray lines over here to the left, those are samples taken during those overturn events I told you about. So, you know, this orange line, that's early November, and this gray line is late April. And those were when we were out there sampling when our water temperatures were similar from surface to bottom. And so we were getting a mixing event where all the water homogenizes. So similar to temperature, we also measure dissolved oxygen each time we go out. And so just as you can see in the picture, we lower an instrument down and we take a reading every few feet and measure it with depth. Similar, again, affected by this thermocline, our dissolved oxygen is going to vary with depth. Of course, we need the oxygen is essential for our fish and our reptiles and things like that. And but although we have aquatic plants contributing some oxygen by photosynthesis, the majority of our oxygen supply is going to be exchanged with the atmosphere at the surface. So when we go out, and this is a similar graph, only dissolved oxygen, and so you see the various events here. Dissolved oxygen at the temperatures that we are measuring at, about around 8 to 10 to 12 milligrams per liter is saturated with dissolved oxygen. So you can see our first measurements were taken at about 2 feet depth there, and we're saturated there at the surface. And then again, for about that first 10 feet in depth, our dissolved oxygen doesn't change much. It stays about the same because that top water is mixed through wind and boating action and stuff. Then we hit about that 10-foot mark. We hit that thermocline where our cold water and our warmer water are being separated. And all of a sudden our oxygen concentrations drop off dramatically to the left. And that is because that deeper water, that's deep water where plants aren't growing, and that's also deeper water that doesn't have access to the surface. So it gets depleted of oxygen pretty quickly. And that red dashed line there is 5 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen. That's a general threshold where various fish species start to become stressed from lack of oxygen. So when you look at this graph, it would suggest that below about 12 to 14 feet, oxygen becomes deficient in the summertime to where you're probably not going to see a whole lot of fish activity down there. Nutrients is another thing that we look at, primarily phosphorus and nitrogen. These, of course, are natural compounds. We're all composed of phosphorus and nitrogen. They're essential for life. Every time something dies and decays, it releases its phosphorus and nitrogen into the environment. So there's many natural sources of phosphorus and nitrogen in our lake water. Typically dying and decaying plants and fish and animals that fall to the bottom. are sources of phosphorus. But phosphorus also binds to soil very well. So anytime we get erosion, anytime going back to these runoff versus infiltration, anytime we get runoff events, we're carrying nutrient to the lake. And so nutrient is essential to the lake. It becomes a problem when it becomes excessive. And that's when we get, excessive plant growth, algae blooms, things like that. There are some man-made sources of nutrients, of course, septic tanks, fertilizers, things like that. Anytime you got erosion. And so what I like to point out is when it comes to managing nutrients, we only have the man-made sources that we can really control. And so we have to work with things we can work with. Sorry. Okay, but so here's phosphorus. Again, a very limited data set. This is we've got a handful of samples from the mid-70s of phosphorus, which are yellow squares, and then we've got our grouping from our study in 2020, 21. If you compare those concentrations, it would suggest that not much has changed in that time in terms of phosphorus concentrations, but that's based on some limited sampling. But those concentrations, I also want to point out the red line at the top is for a seepage lake, and that's for a shallow seepage lake. You guys are a deep seepage lake because you stratify. So your standard would be closer to 30 on that left scale there for total phosphorus. But that standard is kind of a threshold again for when nuisance problems start to develop. The point is all the samples that have been taken have had phosphorus well below that standard in your lake. So it doesn't suggest a lot of problems with the phosphorus. Again, the water type that you have, is so much a problem for Chip in his boom shocking is actually really good for extracting that nutrient out of the water. So that's working for you. The chlorophyll, the green dots are a measure of algae in the water column. And again, on the right-hand column, 6 is kind of a threshold for nuisance algae, and you're well below that. We looked at pollutants, some common pollutants, potassium, chloride, and sodium. Sources of these are road salts, septic systems, ag runoff, things like that. These particular 3 compounds don't appear in lake water naturally. So when we see concentrations of them or elevated concentrations of them, it's indicative of some sort of contamination source, some sort of runoff source. But these pollutants, again, in our 2-year study, were relatively low in Surprise Lake. We looked at the watershed for Surprise Lake, and for those of you who aren't familiar, the watershed is the area of land that is draining to your lake. Essentially based on the topography. Again, we've got rainfall coming down on the landscape, and part of it becomes infiltration and flows towards your lake, and a lot of it becomes runoff and flows towards your lake. But when it comes to managing inputs to your lake, it's important to understand where your watershed is and what the land use is in that watershed. So this is the watershed delineated for Surprise Lake. Based on the topography in the area, it is kind of a funky shape here, but almost 700 acres of land in theory drains to Surprise Lake. And the pie chart at the bottom of the screen there, that's the land use distribution there. So, we've got over 80% of that watershed is forested land, national forest, I think there. And we've got about 3% in herbaceous or barren land, a chunk of wetland there, just a little bit of ag across the road there. But when we model those various land use types combined with the soil types and the topography and things like that, the larger pie chart there to the right models where our nutrient inputs are coming from. And so again, even forest land, has decaying leaves and trees. So even forest land is kicking off nutrient. It's a natural thing to do. That's where the biggest chunk of our nutrient is coming from. And then about 8% of it would be coming from the little bit of ag we have there. But nothing really to be concerned about. The shoreline habitat is another thing we look at. So again, Chip talked about that littoral area, that near shore area is really the crux of the lake. That's what the lake is all about, is that near shore area. Not as much happens out in that deep area. It's that littoral zone where most of the habitat occurs, where most of our lake activity is, and this just visits that again. So our littoral zone is the area where we essentially have aquatic plants growing. And again, over 90% of lake life spends at least part of its life cycle in that area. So it's a really an essential area. And then related to this, there is a state shoreline zoning ordinance for unincorporated areas, which would include you. This has been around since the 1960s. NR 115, you can delve into it as much as you like. It's full of a lot of technical jargon. But what I like to point out is just the picture there on the right side, which kind of, I think, illustrates the intent of the ordinance, which is basically to have a buffer zone around the lake of unmowed vegetation. So whether that vegetation is just left unmowed and to go wild, or whether that vegetation is something more intentional looking, like in that picture in the upper left that's actually been landscaped, that first 35 feet. There's a variety of ways to address that shoreline habitat. But NR 115 is just something to be familiar with, and it's a standard to strive for in the interest of your lake. So there's a shoreline habitat protocol that's been developed over the past few years by the DNR, and similar to our water quality sampling or our aquatic plant monitoring, which is coming up here. This is just intended to be a way to document what exists and to be able to monitor change over time. And so when we do the shoreline survey of Surprise Lake, we assess various things. So we observed 860 feet of artificial beach, for example, 620 feet of riprap, almost 400 feet of impervious surface. There was over 3,000 feet of mowed lawn. Again, this is all within that 35 feet of the water's edge is what's being assessed here. A little bit of erosion, non-conforming buildings. So those are buildings within that 35 feet. That's non-conforming, and that those are grandfathered in. That's not something that's typically allowed anymore. Counted 75 piers on the lake the day of the survey. And then coarse woody habitat, again, going back to Chip, this is your trees, your wood, your logs in the littoral area that is habitat for fish and reptiles and things like that. That was measured in your survey at 6 logs per mile, which is the unit we use there. And what that suggests is that there's a lot of room for some of that development of that habitat for some tree drops, some fish sticks. In this area, and it depends, of course, on the lake, but in this area, a pristine natural lake would typically have more in the order of hundreds of logs per mile, 200 to 300 logs per mile. So there's some room for some structure there, improvements. Overall, it looks like about 66% of the shoreline was considered disturbed, in that first 35 feet was not undisturbed or unmowed. So just documents what we've got, and we can see how we make improvements over time. Just a couple of pictures here. This may or may not apply to your landscape. Again, if you're interested in a shoreline restoration, you can contact Ken Delata. They can come do a site visit with you and just give you ideas, give you recommendations. A shoreline restoration can look as wild or as manicured as you like. There's a lot of different ways to achieve it. And I always like to provide examples for that. And then just the plug for native plants as well. Native plants are plants that have evolved and survived in this area. So they are accustomed to our conditions and accomplish what plants are meant to do in this area. And so this is a scale drawing of some various native species, shoreline species in Wisconsin. And again, this scale drawing both above and below ground. And you can see some of the root depths that some of these species get to that really prevents erosion, holds shorelines, is able to extract nutrient and runoff from going to the lake. That little red box on the left there, that's Kentucky bluegrass. So just to give you a comparison to what a lawn accomplishes as opposed to some native planting. Other ways to increase infiltration, again, just this general theme of mitigating our increased runoff on the landscape is how can we increase infiltration? Doesn't all have to happen right at the water's edge. Anywhere in the watershed, rain gardens, retention basins, rain catchment off your gutters, use water to use to water things later. Something as simple as how your pathway approaches the lake, how your access approaches the lake can greatly affect runoff. Of course, the county conservationist is often working in the county with producers on best management practices, cover crops, reducing ag runoff, things like that. The highway department is becoming wise to how to manage runoff. We obviously don't want water accumulating on our roads, but we've come a long way from shunting that water straight to the nearest lake. We've learned a lot. So again, a lot of resources out there, a lot of assistance, cost sharing, and referrals available. Aquatic plants. So this is another chapter in our lake plan here. Of course, aquatic plants are necessary. They're our food and shelter in the lake, right? And they're important. They're important to the system of the lake. And so we can evaluate these plants. We have a protocol for surveying these plants, and then you can it's a sort of survey that you can reproduce in future years to monitor change. And I always say a good lake plant person can probably tell you more about your lake than I can with all my chemistry samples, just based on what types of species you're seeing, the relative abundance of those species. So we do what's called a point intercept survey, and a grid is created for your lake, as you see here. And each one of these points has a GPS coordinate. And so the crew navigates out to that GPS coordinate on the lake, anchors their boat, and then drops a rake down to that point, scrapes the bottom and pulls it up. And then they inventory what's on that rake. And again, in future iterations, we can go to visit these same spots and see how things may have changed. And so some of the results of this survey here, this is a map of rake fullness. So again, I talked about that rake we drop. It's a modified garden rake, essentially. If it's not long enough, we tie a rope on it to lower it down, but we lower it down at that point and scrape the bottom, grab the bottom and pull it up. And then we look at what's on that rake. So we inventory what species are on that rake and how much is on that rake. So this map you're looking at here is the result of rake fullness. So each time we pull up that rake, we give it a 0, a 1, 2, or a 3, depending on how much mass of plant material is on that rake. And of course, a 3 would be a heaping full rake. A 0, nothing comes up on that rake. And so when you see here, this would show the rake fullness for Surprise Lake, and Some lakes have some empty spots in the middle where you're not quite, where you get too deep to get plants. But this would suggest that most of Surprise Lake is littoral. There's plants growing throughout the lake. In most locations, it was a 1, but you can see pretty quickly the areas where you've got the red dots, where we had 3s on the rake. And so that's just kind of your overall mass abundance. This is the various species. So overall, 16 different plant species were observed in your lake during the survey. And here's their list of them. And the map there shows the number of species located at each of those points. So you can kind of see real quickly where in your lake is most of the diversity. It looks like we've got a band there across the middle where the most variety of our species exist. And so there's the list of our species. Not all plants are created equal, I always say. So with that column there on the right in that table is the C value for each of those species. So a plant that is more tolerant of disturbance, that you can't really bother. It can survive in bad conditions. That is a plant that gets a lower C value on a scale of 1 to 10. A plant that is very rare, or a plant that is very intolerant of disturbance, or needs a very sensitive or careful environment, that gets a C value of 10, and everywhere in between. And so you can see the variety of species we found there, and we did find dwarf water milfoil with a C value of 10. So again, that's just and then lower down on the list, bluntleaf pondweed 9, water bulrush 9, creeping bladderwort 9. These are all high quality aquatic plant species. And so when you see a group of those in a lake, again, that's just suggestive of a really good ecosystem, a really good habitat that exists. There is a report that you can also find online that takes all these individual lake studies and wraps them into one document and ranks them. The table there at the bottom left is from that report. Just shows all the various lakes that we've done so far in the study and the number of species that was discovered in each of those lakes. 16 species is on the lower half of that scale. And so again, generally, the more species, we consider that healthy, good diversity. You guys don't have quite the diversity of some of the other lakes, but you have some high quality plants. So even though it's not suggested on this particular graph, you guys are up there in terms of quality of aquatic plants. The 3 most abundant plant species that were observed, the most abundant was creeping bladderwort, which has a C value of 9. So that's your most abundant species was actually a pretty sensitive species. So that speaks well to the health of your lake. Creeping bladderworts are actually carnivorous plants. They have a stack of reservoir that sits open, and when a bug or insect goes in there, it snaps shut, and they digest those nutrients. So it's kind of like your own little Venus flytrap there. But if there's a picture there at the bottom of one blooming, they just kind of float around. They may seem like a nuisance plant periodically if it gets caught up in your prop or something, but they're really neat plants. And if you pull them out, you can see those little sacs. Bluntleaf pondweed. Bluntleaf pondweed, second most, a little over the third of the sites of bluntleaf pondweed. That's also a C value of 9, very sensitive plant. And you can see that even came up as a 3 on the rake there in that southern lobe there of the lake. So some high quality plants down in there. And then a third of the sites also had Nightella, which is it's technically a macroalgae, not a plant, not a macrophyte, if you will. But it's a great plant to have. Loves to suck the nutrient, loves to suck the oxygen out of the water column. So it's a good one to have around. invasive species, the only invasive species that have observed on Surprise Lake that we have documented are the ornamental water lily. And so first documented in 2016. So this is a lot like your classic lily pad. The ornamental water lily is native to the East Coast, but it's not native in the Midwest. So it is considered an exotic and can be an invasive. I'm not sure, it did not show up in that list of species from the survey there, so I don't know if it's become a big problem there or not. But again, it may be hard to distinguish from the native lily pads. And then the purple loosestrife is also a common one. Both of these plants are typically ornamentals that have escaped to the lab, if you will. Recreation, there's no wake on Surprise Lake, correct me if I'm wrong, between 4 p.m. and 10 a.m. And there's 2 public boat landings, and they're both owned and maintained by the township. It's good to know who's in charge of your boat landings in your area. It could be the Forest Service, county, or anybody, but if there's issues with your boat landings or issues with regulations on your lake, the local municipality are the ones in control of that. One more question here from the survey. What could be done to restore, maintain or improve Surprise Lake? And again, this is where I got the comments about water levels, potential water level drawdown, and then again, the comments about the excessive watercraft speeds or operation, things like that. So I don't know if that's a consensus with folks in general that that's an issue, but we can talk about that. Any additional comments? The water level is up, and the question is this the new normal, or will it go back down? And I don't know. Ken, maybe I can ask you what you know about the water level on Surprise. Is there do we have a monitoring well there?
We do not, but
Okay.
if I recollect correctly, it's gone back down to more normal. And you people on the lake can answer that, I guess, but from what I've seen, I think we had 2 years there of over double the average rainfall, so you weren't the only lake that was way above above level.
Does anyone is the water level coming back down there on Surprise? Does anyone have a comment on that? I will say, just not specific to Surprise, but obviously whether it be there are natural fluctuations, whether it be climate change or something else that, but the fluctuation in lake level is a very natural thing. Surprise Lake, again, has been around 10,000 years. It's probably spent time 20 feet higher and 20 feet lower at one point or another. So, that, no, you don't think so. But, so that lake level fluctuation is natural for the most part. It's being a steepage lake, that lake level is basically a window into the water table. So that's essentially your water table elevation that's fluctuating depending on our average precipitation.
And I can say during this same time, we do have a lake level monitoring station on Archibald Lake, and they were 5 feet high. And up until just this last year, now they're about 1.5 feet high yet. So they've been the slowest one coming down. But then we also have one on Paya. I think they've got up to almost 3 feet high at that same point, and they're down pretty close to normal now on that lake. So, like I say, the whole area seen a big influx of obviously the water table and stuff, but
yeah. Yeah, on a seepage lake, you're kind of at the mercy of the landscape and the water table. There aren't a lot of really effective ways to control the water level in a seepage lake. If you were an impoundment, had some sort of dam or something like that to control. Some lakes have tried putting, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, everyone was dry and trying to get more water into their lake and trying to pump water into their lake. And, now they're trying to pump it out. But, it's I guess my recommendation is that, it speaks to that 35-foot buffer. That's part of the intent of that, I think, is to allow for some of that water level fluctuation. We put our dock, we put our gazebo where we like it, but 10 years from now, that might not be where the lake's located, and just part of that fluctuation. I don't know what you guys are experiencing there, but yeah, it was high everywhere there for a while.
With that, I see we got Derek in the comments. It's got its pink in color instead of white. I believe he's talking about the ornamental water lily.
Oh, okay.
That's correct.
So that's how you can identify that on the lake. 'Cause the regular lilies are good, but
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Sorry, I got kicked off again there. So yeah, going forward, what we'll do is create a initial draft of the plan. Basically, it incorporates all this information you've seen tonight, and then with those goals and action items populated at the end. So we'll send that out via email. We should have everyone's email. Ken should have everyone's email from this meeting tonight. So in the next few weeks, I'll send out a draft of that plan to you all, and essentially just review it and let me know what you think, comment on it, make recommendations, critiques, whatever you got. If there's something you like in there, let me know. If there's something that you're not comfortable with, let me know. If you have a neighbor that wasn't here tonight, or a friend, or that likes the lake, that you want to forward this on to, please feel free. The more minds, the better. We'll spend a few weeks taking comments from folks. You can contact any of us. It'll all funnel into the plan here. So if you talk to Ken or myself, again, phone call, email, whatever works for you. We'll send out a new draft based on some of those comments. And we'll also be getting comments from the various DNR folks as well on what's in there. And then we'll just kind of do that iterative process until we have some consensus on the plan. And then once you guys have something you like, we'll finalize it and send it off. Just remembering that this is not anything written in stone. It's just the plan going forward as we know it. And then anytime things change or are updated, you can make those changes to the plan. But how you want to do that, usually I take comments and things individually, but sometimes people get together, go over it together, discuss it. Maybe this is an opportunity to form a committee or a friends group to look at it. At the very least, you should have a good email list of folks on the lake and a start to that network there. So anyone to add? Cool. All right. Again, feel free to contact any one of us. Be looking for that draft plan in your email, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon. And good luck with your lake. It sounds like overall, again, you guys have a great lake. It sounds like you've got some heavy boat use and stuff like that, but the lake so far, as far as I can tell, is managing it pretty well. You've got some great species, great plant species, good water quality. Things look wonderful. Enjoy it.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.